Happy Friday. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what's called New Kingdom Egypt, and then we're going to go some into ancient Greece, which is considered classical culture. First we want to talk about New Kingdom Egypt, and what's considered to be New Kingdom was brought on by this guy, and his name is Akhenaten, and he's named after the sun god Aten. This was a different tradition than the ancient Egyptians were used to. And I mentioned that in class the other day. Ancient Egypt was traditionally a polytheistic society, so they had a lot of different gods that were being worshipped, and each different god had reign over different parts of society and spiritual life. Akhenaten said there's only one God, and it's the sun, and I represent that God on earth as Pharaoh. And again, the Pharaoh wasn't just a person. It was considered to be godly to be a Pharaoh. So either you were already related to the gods, or after your death at some point you had a chance to become a god. So it's a lot more than just being a king or a ruler. Akhenaten had named himself after that ruler, and as far as we know, this is the first time in human history when we had a monotheistic society, meaning that there was just one god. That's a pretty normal concept now, but at the time of ancient Egypt, most likely this was considered very radical, and it probably put a lot of people out of business because religion, and you can make the argument today that religion is still involved with business, and people that would make statues and make temples, a lot of them were put out of work when Akhenaten said there's only one God, and so he was not very popular with some segments of the population. You may have noticed that the sculpture of Akhenaten looks different than the rest of the pharaohs that we looked at in class. The body's more organic, it's curvier, in some ways it looks feminine compared to the other pharaoh sculptures we saw. The face is elongated, the lips are larger. Akhenaten didn't just change the religion, he also changed the visual style of art, especially the way pharaohs were portrayed, and there's some mystery about this. Historians wonder why he made this change. Was it something stylistic, or did it have something to do with the way he actually looked? And chances are that the pharaoh might not have looked like everybody else at this time, and so we see these kind of strange artistic conventions occur. This statue is found in what was believed to be an art school at the time, a place to train people that were going to make statues or images of the pharaoh and his family, and this is one of the pharaoh's wives. Her name was Nefertiti. She was his most famous and most public wife, and it's believed that she helped out a lot with the government of ancient Egypt at the time. The reason that one of the eyes looks blank or unfinished is because it is unfinished. Chances are that it was a model that was being used to train artists. As you can see, Nefertiti, even in the days of ancient Egypt, still today would be considered very glamorous, with a long slender neck and makeup, which wasn't just restricted to females. There was also a very heavy male use of makeup according to artwork from the time. This relief sculpture is an image of the Egyptian royal family at the time. So we see Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and you also notice that there are some children that are playing. Look at the shape of their heads. So all the shapes of the heads of these children are just like Akhenaten had himself depicted, with a skull that was elongated in the back. That seems to us to look rather strange. Also notice the disk in the sky, which represented that one single god, the sun, and their little hands that are coming off of these rays of light. And in some of those hands you see a symbol called an Ankh, which is an ancient Egyptian symbol for everlasting life or immortality. So what we're seeing is the sun god giving immortality to the pharaoh, and perhaps to his family as well. The pharaoh Akhenaten had several children, and one of those children was named Tutankhamun. His original name was Tutankhaten, but after his father's death, his name was changed to reflect the popular gods in Egypt, because after his father died, Egypt went straight back into being their old polytheistic multi-god religion, and the very young Tutankhamun became pharaoh. Really young pharaoh became Pharaoh when he was, I think, 12 years old, and ruled until he was 18, when he was believed to have died. Now, the reason that King Tut is famous is not necessarily because of anything he accomplished while he was Pharaoh. It's because his tomb was found intact, and to this day is one of the very few Egyptian tombs that have been found that have not been raided and had all the gold and all the precious objects taken out. So that's King Tut. King Tut's tomb was discovered by an archaeologist named Howard Carter in 1922. And the one reason it had lasted through antiquity without having everything stolen out of it was because it was hidden beneath a lot of other tombs. And the reason for this is unclear. And there are some indicators that Tut's tomb perhaps was not originally meant for him. It was meant for maybe someone lower in rank, and he died unexpectedly, and then they made use of it because it was very important to have this embalming ceremony, to have the mummy made and then all these objects put into the tomb so that the Pharaoh could go into the afterlife and do what he needed to do, and then rise like the sun did every day. There was a comparison in Egyptian religion between the sun setting and the death of the Pharaoh, and then when the sun rose the next day, it was like the Pharaoh had gone through the underworld and been reborn again. This tomb was packed full of stuff. There was one room that was dedicated to the sarcophagus and the mummy. There was another room that had lots of treasures and things in it. There was a little room that you can see in the back that just seemed to have had haphazard objects thrown into it because they had to be included, but they ran out of space. Lots of interesting stuff. Here's an actual photograph from the tomb. As you can see, there's lots of objects in there. Chariot wheels. The chariot itself had to be taken apart to be put into the tomb so it would fit. The thing that looks like a lion is actually an embalming table. So it's believed that these tables would have been used during the process of embalming, where they would put the Pharaoh on the table and take out some of his internal organs and prepare his body to be mummified and preserve it. And then those organs themselves were put into small jars and preserved in a separate shrine that we'll look at in a moment, that's in another room. Other things in the room included some of the Pharaoh's personal items while he was alive. A lot of this stuff was never meant to be seen by living people. It was created just for the afterlife, just for the death of the Pharaoh. The white objects that you see on the underside of the table is food, and it's like a bunch of little lunch boxes, and it's been analyzed to contain things like roast duck and different meals that would help sustain King Tut in his journey through the underworld. So this idea of taking on a journey was taken pretty seriously, and it was almost like a living person was going somewhere instead of a dead mummy. One of the rooms was dedicated to the sarcophagus. It's Greek for consumer of flesh, sarcophagus. And the sarcophagus was underneath a series of shrines that were made out of gilded wood. A lot of these objects are not solid gold. Some are, but most are what are called gilded wood. So it's wood with gold leaf and a very thin layer hammered onto it. So the mummy itself was inside a series of sarcophagi. There was a large stone sarcophagus, and then inside of that there was a large wooden sarcophagus covered with gold leaf. Inside of that there was another one, and in the third coffin there was a solid gold coffin, and that is where the mummy was actually located. The mummy itself was wrapped up in bandages, as you may imagine, and inside those bandages were golden items and amulets that were believed to have magical powers by the ancient Egyptians. And Howard Carter and his team were so interested in getting at those objects that they damaged the mummy a lot while they were doing that. That includes the head of the mummy that was covered with a solid gold mask. Also had inlaid jewels. They were so interested in getting that golden object that they actually ripped the head off of the mummy in an effort to get the mask. Looking back today, it seems like a very bad idea, because to us, DNA evidence becomes such a possibility for exploration. But during the 1920s, people didn't think about human remains that way, and so it got a much different treatment than it got if it would be discovered today. Other items discovered in the tomb include a throne made out of gilded wood or gold-covered wood depicting the pharaoh and his wife, who was also his half-sister. So that's kind of interesting, and it turns out that that may have been common in ancient Egypt for royal families to intermarry so that they could keep the power and the wealth and the prominence of being pharaoh within the same family. As a result of this, there may have been some birth defects. And so when we look at the head of King Tut and we notice that it's a kind of a strange shape compared to most human heads, that's one possibility. We don't know that for sure. Another possibility is some other genetic disorder or perhaps a disease. We don't know. But we're pretty sure that he married his half-sister. This item is referred to as a canopic shrine. And earlier when I was talking about taking the internal organs out of the pharaoh and mummifying those separately, this is where they went, into specialized jars that were placed inside of this shrine. And the statues of the goddesses that you see in the afterlife would come to life, and they would be responsible for putting those organs back into the pharaoh to get that mummy up and living again. Also, you'll see images of cobra snakes, which was one of the symbols of the pharaoh, and this again is made out of gilded wood, so it's wood covered with a thin layer of gold leaf. Here's King Tut's head. As you can tell, the back's elongated, and it doesn't quite look normal. It looks a lot like those sculptures that we looked at of Akhenaten. So when we talk about the way that style changed during the New Kingdom in Egypt, maybe it changed because it was based on reality. Maybe Akhenaten really looked like that. Here's a couple of artist conceptions of what Tut may have looked like while he was alive. Notice the makeup that was common, we believe, with males and females of royal family in ancient Egypt. Tut, once again, famous because his tomb was found, not so much because of his accomplishments as pharaoh. There is some writing about Tut, but not much. One of the things that he may have been responsible for is restoring that polytheistic society to Egypt that his father had radically torn down. In the same period of time that we're talking about these cultures in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and then ancient Egypt, there were also cultures in what's called the Aegean Sea. That's the modern-day body of water between Greece and Turkey. And these islands in the Aegean and then some settlements on the coast of Greece really had a big effect on what's going to be known later as Greek culture, affecting things like myths and legends and monsters. And there may be some basis in fact for some of these mythological events that took place. For example, the really complex palace, 5-story palace that was built around 2500 BCE on the island of Crete was much like a labyrinth, where according to myth that monstrous minotaur lived, and they used bull symbols a lot. So did Mesopotamia. We talked about that. Along with that was the island of Santorini. Half of it was blown apart by a volcanic eruption in ancient days. Could have had something to do with that myth of Atlantis. There's all kinds of things that point towards that in ancient culture. So these pre-Greek societies that were in the area contribute to what we're going to know as Greek society, and then that is still contributing to our culture today. And we'll talk in class some about how these artistic and philosophical and scientific ideas from ancient Greece are adopted by Rome and then are still used today in buildings that sometimes you see on campuses like Radford University. We divide ancient Greek artwork up into 4 basic time periods, the earliest being geometric, and it's called geometric because humans were represented by geometrical shapes like squares and triangles and circles. Then we get into what's called the archaic period. There's more of a focus on the human form, and it's very influenced by styles from Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. Then we get into what's called the classical period, which is probably the most influential to us, and that's a time in history where we see this great concern with beauty as a concept. So artwork is not just being made to say something about leadership or about the rulers of the society or gods. There's actually this real interest in human beauty, and that goes along with humanism and philosophy and education and things like that. Then finally the Hellenistic period, and that's when we consider Greek culture to be spreading throughout the Western world, much of that due to the accomplishments of Alexander the Great, conquering territories and then spreading Greek culture as he goes. Not a lot of examples survive from this oldest geometric period of Greek art. A lot of this artwork appears on pottery, and a lot of that pottery has been broken and then it's carefully pieced back together so that we can see what it looked like. In the ceramic vessel that we're looking at, you can see that geometric representation of human figures, and I think what we're looking at here is a funeral procession of some kind. There seems to be a very large figure that is laid out on a table, which may have been a ruler or a king, and we're looking at the story of the funeral procession. So you see chariots that are being pulled by horses, soldiers marching, and all of these figures being represented in a very abstract way through geometric forms. There are many, many fine examples of ancient Greek pottery, and the ancient Greeks developed these styles of pots, and potters still enjoy making these today, and each one had its own specific use. These were made on a wheel and they were fired in a high temperature kiln, but it worked a little different without electricity, of course. The hydria made to store water, and other types made to store wine, and then drinking cups, and each one had its special purpose. The archaic period of ancient Greek art did involve what seemed to be more concerned with the human form and more large sculptures, sometimes larger than life size. There were rules about the way that these were made, and the name for the female forms were called chore. And if you'll notice, it's starting to look quite realistic. It's not quite exactly real yet, but certainly more so than in the geometric period. The male forms were known as choros, and if you look closely at it, you'll see that relationship to ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian art. Some of the statues we looked at of the pharaohs are almost exactly like this choros. The left leg is forward, the stylized kneecap and shin bone. The figures often had this look on their face, and sometimes it's referred to as the archaic smile, and this also begins the Greek tradition of depicting males as being fully nude. Usually the females in Greek sculpture had clothing on, but the males were fully nude, and the Greeks celebrated athleticism, like the Olympics. That's where it comes from, is ancient Greece, and they liked to make sculptures of athletic forms. If you walk around campus, you're going to see some buildings that still utilize Greek architectural orders. Now, the Greeks had these orders for their religious temples that they would make, and a lot of these temples were open air, so they weren't necessarily functional buildings. They were built to be beautiful. They were made in a way just like large-scale sculptures, and there have been lots of variations today, but generally we define these orders by what's called a capital, which is the top part of the column on a building. So the capitals, for example, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian are the most common. There's no Corinthian on RU campus, but there's lots of Doric and Ionic. Also, there's a triangular area called a pediment, which is in the front of the building. So that triangular pediment seems to be held up by these columns, and then usually that triangular pediment was full of sculpture, and the sculpture depicted Greek gods and goddesses, and sometimes the sculpture's shape was specifically made to go in a certain part of that pediment. Like this sculpture that you see was made to go in the very corner, and then they were arranged according to the shape of that triangle. We're working towards the classical style, which really reaches maturity in Greece around 500 BCE, and that classical style was based on a mathematical idea of beauty. So these really beautiful temples with these different architectural orders were decorated with this really beautiful sculpture. The oldest of these Greek orders was called Dorian, and they were named after different parts of Greece, and these are known by that saucer-shaped capital you see up at the top of that column. Ionic had the scroll shape, and again Corinthian had a very flowered, fancy capital, and that turned out to be probably the favorite of the Romans. You may be familiar with that graphic novel and then a movie that came out several years ago called 300 that featured the Spartan army in league with the Athenians. They were fighting against the Persian Empire. That was based on some historical events, and the Greek city-states fought the Persian Empire for a long time. Eventually that war ended, and the Greeks came out victorious, not that they took over Persian territory, but because they were able to hold on to their own culture and not be conquered. One reason they were able to do that was because of the navy that was owned by the Athenians. So if you recall in the movie, Sparta, of course, was a very powerful military force, but when it came to fighting in the sea, the city-state of Athens was the one that had all the ships to do that. And in order to help with that fight, they collected taxes from the other Greek city-states, and then that helped them eventually win that conflict. After that war was over, Athens was very rich. They had all of this tax money, and they decided to use it to make buildings. One reason to do this was, in a way, it was like a tourist attraction. Now, these were religious temples, but they would draw people from all over the Western world. So by investing that money in this building campaign, they might get returns for years to come. So during this, what's referred to as the classical age, sometimes called the Golden Age, considered to be a time of peace when Athens had a lot of money, and we see these buildings start to pop up. In the city of Athens, there's a big rock that sticks up out of the city. That's called the Acropolis, Acropolis, which means high city. Originally it was probably used for defensive purposes. During this Greek Golden Age, it was used to make religious temples. And so the Acropolis is a place where these temples exist. And the different temples include one that's probably the most famous, known as the Parthenon. And the Parthenon was dedicated to the patron goddess of Athens, who was Athena. So this religious temple was made in order to please the gods and also to become a tourist attraction, and still considered by many to be one of the most beautiful buildings in Western history. At first glance, you can tell pretty quickly it's a Doric column, and it's a very refined Doric style with the saucer-shaped capitals at the top. And there's some things that are subtle about it that are really hard to see with your naked eye, but if you measure it, you'll notice that the columns aren't perfectly straight. They swell in the middle. That's called entasis, which might be reminiscent of human musculature, the way muscles expand and contract. So the columns aren't straight. Also, they tilt in at an angle, so if you extended the lines of the columns, they would actually intersect a couple of miles over top of the Parthenon. Really sophisticated building design. Now the inner walls and the inner columns use an Ionic style. In part that was probably a political move because they were using tax money to do it. They included the style used by the Ionians in order to build it. The front originally had the full triangular pediment, and it was filled with relief sculpture. And then relief sculpture also decorated the frieze that goes around the edges. Now those three bars are called triglyphs, and in between each one of those triglyphs would be what are called metopes, which are areas of relief sculpture, and they depicted different things about Greek mythology and Greek history. At one point inside of the Parthenon was this giant statue of the goddess Athena. It was 40 feet tall, and the clothing and the armor was made out of solid gold, and the skin was covered with ivory. So it was a really beautiful sculpture. In a way, this was the treasury of Athens. The money that they had left over was stored in the form of gold, and that gold took the form of this sculpture. There was also a reflecting pool that was in front of it, and the water in the pool probably served to hydrate the ivory so that it didn't crack. Nobody knows what happened to this gold or what happened to this statue. We were pretty sure it existed because of other artworks that were done about it and coins at the time, but it's a mystery as far as what happened to the actual material. It was probably melted down and used for a war. A lot of these photographs I hope you think are good because I took them myself. I spent a semester in graduate school studying ancient art history in Greece, and it was awesome. And I could go on and on and on and on about it. Lots of details and really lots of information. If it's something that you're interested in, come talk to me about it. Sometimes I love to talk about this stuff, if you can't tell. For now, I'm going to move it along a little faster and talk about some of the terms that are going to be on the test, some good things to know about art history, which include the sculptural style of human forms that was being done during this classical age was based largely, as I mentioned, on mathematics. So when you see these sculptures of athletes, real people don't look like this. If you have a certain kind of genetics and you get on a nutrition program and work with a personal trainer as soon as you hit puberty and of all these things, you might come close to having a body style like this, but the reality is that it's based on math. It's not real. It's an abstract concept. So these images of athletes, the width of the shoulders is based mathematically on the length of the torso and the length of the arm and how big around it is. All that's math. It's not based on the way anybody actually looks. And this was the Greek way of expressing godlike perfect beauty, which was the biggest interest of classical Greek artwork, was that beauty. Of course, it did have a religious and social element to it, but it was pretty unique in the history of the world to have this time of peace dedicated to these humanistic ideals. The stance that you're looking at featured in this statue is known as contrapposto, and contrapposto means weight shift, and you'll notice it looks like all the weight of the figure is shifted to the back leg, and the ancient Greeks discovered that this made the figure look much more dynamic and much more lifelike. The idea that it could spring into motion at any point. That knowledge during what we call the Middle Ages is going to become lost for a while, and then it's going to be rediscovered and used in artwork in a time that we refer to as the Renaissance, and we'll talk about that. The people in Greece don't call their country Greece, they call it Hellas, and so Hellenistic is just another word for Greek. And during the Hellenistic art period, we consider that to be when Alexander the Great was conquering territories and spreading Greek ideas throughout the Western world. As far as the art itself goes, there was more of an interest in drama and emotion. It's really important to remember about classical artwork that when you look at the figures, you don't see any emotion on the faces, and that's because it's based on an ideal human that, according to the Greeks, solved problems using rationality and thinking and education, and didn't get caught up in emotion. During this Hellenistic period, we see lots of emotion. Emotion on the faces of the figures, and also the figures themselves. The subjects start to change, so it's not just about gods and athletes and kings anymore. It becomes about, for example, old market woman, a woman walking down the street. The sculpture with the man and his two sons is about Laocoon, who was a priest, and this priest lived in Troy, and you might have heard about the Greek and Trojan War and the Trojan horse and that story. Laocoon had a vision that the Greeks were going to trick the Trojans with a gift, and this angered Athena, so she sent a serpent to strangle him and his children to death, and that's what you see happening in that sculpture about Laocoon. Lots of emotion, Hellenistic period. It's weekend time again, isn't it? Hey, I hope you have a great weekend, and if you haven't done it yet, read those chapters 15 and 16. That's going to help you out a lot with the test that's coming up, and that test will be on Wednesday. And of course, you can bring a 3x5 note card with anything you want written on it. No printed material, but write it, draw pictures, whatever you want to do. Hey, I know that many of you guys don't necessarily have a big interest in art or a big interest in history or Um, Sometimes I meet students and I'm not sure what they're interested in, and life's like that, and you meet a lot of different people. But the best advice that I could give anybody trying to accomplish anything is find a way to care about what you're doing. And there are going to be some classes that you're not really into. That's going to happen. There's going to be a job that you work at some point that you don't like. There's going to be situations that you don't enjoy. But the best thing that you can do for yourself is to find a way to care about what you're doing. And when you care about what you're doing, that makes life so much easier. It makes it so much richer. So you can look at a situation and dismiss it and say, I don't care about that, and I never will. And um, that's fine. But if you do decide to care about it, it's going to open up so many doors. And you'll find that there's a really interesting world out there. And things that you might never have thought much about are very deep and they're very rich. And any path that you choose, you can follow it for a long, long way if you want to. And it just makes life better, You probably know a lot of people, and the people in your own life, think about them. Who seems happier? The people that don't have anything they care about, the people that are bored all the time and hate everything, or the people that find life interesting and that find things that they enjoy? Who seems like they're having more fun? Who seems healthier and happier? Just think about that. And hey, do your best, stay safe, and I will see you guys really soon.